I'm a developer relations specialist at a company called Sanity.io, which is a headless CMS or a place where you can go and edit content. I care a lot about web accessibility, and I've worked in web accessibility for a long time. I learned kind of the hard way that it would be really good if web accessibility was somewhat easier, and if there were ways that web accessibility could be kind of taken away from web developers and moved to browsers and CMSs, because they can impact a lot, because they are the ones where we create content and where we look at content. So there's a lot where kind of browsers and CMSs can actually impact what the accessibility situation is. And I'm kind of interested in that. Like, yes, we all need to do our best and make sure that websites are accessible when we work on them. But if some browsers and CMSs can do a part of that, I think that would be really cool.
How do you personally go about explaining the importance of online accessibility to someone who'd never considered it before?
So it kind of depends on the person I'm talking to, but what I often do is look at the real world, thinking about stuff that we do in the real world that make the real world more accessible, like tactile pavements that we have to lead people through the way that they need to go, to like traffic lights that make sounds so that people know what the status is. Kind of saying we're going to do that, but for our websites or for our digital experiences. That sometimes works. Sometimes I'll have to say, there's legal requirements, or you'll lose money when you don't make it accessible because you're losing out part of your customers. So I have a bunch of different arguments for accessibility, and I use them kind of when I think they're most effective, because it really depends on the person you're talking to.
How do you think the internet will change over the next 10 years? Or the internet or the web will change over the next 10 years? And what specific features or habits that exist now do you hope will be seen as of their time?
So one of the major ones that I hope will somewhat disappear is the kind of building custom components for the web relies on ARIA. That is something that is the case today, where as a web developer, you need to do a lot of the accessibility groundwork yourself. And one of the things I'm hoping for in the next while is that we'll get new additions to HTML where ARIA components are actually part of the HTML specification. So when you're trying to build tabs, there's a tabs thing in HTML where you can't really get the ARIA wrong because you're not doing the ARIA. The browser does it for you. That would be really cool. Some of that work is happening in a group called OpenUI that I'm a part of. It is also really challenging. Like, how do you actually make it work, and how can you come up with components that everyone is happy with? We all know like the select element that is part of the browser and it does accessibility automatically, but we're not as happy with it as browser makers would want, because we always customize them and try and do our own things with them and build them out of divs, because it's hard to customize. So there are challenges to overcome there, but one of the main things I hope for the web and for web accessibility is that there's more stuff built into HTML, and it becomes, by that method, kind of becomes easier to do accessibility on the web.
If you're with someone who needs to check how accessible their website is, but only has 5 minutes, talk us through how you might go about showing them.
I love this question. I do this a lot with customers. Just tell them things like, hey, have you tried to get through your website with a tab key, and see how they get on? Sometimes they can see where they are because there's focus tells, and sometimes they get stuck right at that point. That's a really interesting way to try and find out if you have any issues. The other is zooming in. So if you zoom into like 400%, you can also quite quickly find out if your website works well, if it's responsive, etc. So that usually also gives away quite a lot.
In terms of the adoption of accessible digital products, what do you think is the biggest challenge?
I think it's hard to get people who make products to do accessibility, and that has been hard for decades, and these standards have existed for decades, but I do feel it's starting to improve. But I think that is one of the biggest challenges, to kind of center product development around accessibility and make sure that things are accessible by default. it becomes increasingly clear that it is important, with like legislation and with more people starting to understand how digital accessibility works. But I think that is the main thing, like getting companies to actually understand their role in all of this. And I think that becomes increasingly clear that it's not just about websites, but also about kind of products around websites and intranets and things like that, where before maybe people would have said, we don't have anyone who works here with a disability, so we don't need to care about internal products. It is now increasingly the case that I know from accessibility auditors that I know and work that I've done that it is increasingly the case that we look at intranets as well, and like internal products, because of course it also matters there, just like on the web that is for the outside world.
What is one thing that every single person can do or learn to play a part in the progression towards an accessible web?
Yeah, for me, that's probably to try and understand your own assumptions. So it used to be the case that websites were 800 by 600 pixels. That isn't the case today, and that assumption could have hurt you if you were building websites that way, and suddenly smaller screens came out. I think for me that is the major thing. So to think about, people might not use their computer with a mouse, they might be using touch or a keyboard or combination of those things. So any assumptions you have, try and get rid of them, because that will probably make it a lot easier to make accessible experiences, to really think in terms of no assumptions at all, and like try to get them out of your assumptions, out of your brain. Basically, it's basically understanding like not everyone uses the computer in the same way that you do, and you probably use it differently than other people. Like there is a lot of difference there, and paying attention to that is going to get us super far in terms of accessibility.